The winds howled through the corridors of El Escorial, as though the ancient stones themselves recoiled from what had just been born. On a gray October day in 1784, in a chamber draped with tapestries of saints and martyrs, the future of Spain let out its first cry. But it was not a cry of vigor. It was thin, reluctant, almost as though the infant already sensed what lay ahead. Ferdinand, the firstborn son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, was welcomed with cautious celebration. The court bowed, physicians offered formal nods, and a choir hummed a solemn hymn. Yet in a smaller, windowless room tucked beneath the royal nursery, two court doctors exchanged glances. They had seen it clearly. This was no ordinary heir. The child's genitalia were malformed. The condition described in whispered Latin as hypospadias profunda cum micropenia was far more than a physical oddity. In the rigid world of Bourbon-Habsburg dynastic politics, where masculinity was measured in heirs and holy rights, it was a silent catastrophe. But silence was precisely what the court chose. Royal scribes recorded the birth in golden ink. Midwives were dismissed with payment and warning. The child was bathed not by nurses, but by trusted clerics. His cradle, carved from cedar and draped in crimson silk, stood beneath a portrait of Saint Peter, patron of broken keys. As Ferdinand slept, incense burned continuously, masking the scent of sterilizing tinctures and the iron tinge of fear. His early years unfolded within a carefully controlled cage of ritual and observation. Unlike other royal children, he was not allowed to ride horses or play in the gardens. Instead, he was trained to kneel in chapel for hours, reciting liturgies he barely understood. When he asked why the other boys had swimming tutors and fencing masters while he had restoration sessions, the palace physician muttered about divine patience. Ferdinand never asked again. By the age of 8, he had become a silent observer of the palace's inner life. Servants often caught him standing perfectly still behind curtains, watching their movements. He began sketching anatomical diagrams with unsettling precision, tearing pages from medical texts he wasn't meant to access. His bedroom was rearranged to remove all mirrors after he shattered one during a night fit. He claimed the reflection had grinned at him with someone else's mouth. Every few weeks, he was taken to the underground infirmary of El Escorial, where a rotating cast of foreign doctors examined his body and suggested instruments designed in German steel and French leather. One such device, part splint, part vice, left him bleeding for days. During these sessions, he learned not to scream but to recite psalms. Pain became a form of ritual, and ritual became a form of power. His education followed no ordinary path. While other princes studied Latin and military strategy, Ferdinand's curriculum revolved around sacred geometry, divine kingship, and genealogies of saints and sovereigns. The topic of reproduction was studiously avoided. His tutors never spoke of marriage, only alliances. The boy began to associate the word succession with dread. By his 10th birthday, Ferdinand no longer smiled. He walked with careful steps, each movement deliberate, as though he feared that any sudden action might break him further. He avoided sunlight, preferring the cloisters and shadowed libraries of the royal monastery. He rarely spoke during meals, and when he did, it was often to ask about the lives of his long-dead ancestors, the mad ones, the disfigured, the childless. One day, exploring a disused corridor in the eastern wing, he discovered a door without a handle. Intrigued, he returned at night with a letter opener and pried it loose. What lay behind chilled him more deeply than any surgical instrument ever had. It was a sealed room of stone, lit only by the moonlight filtering through dust-crusted slats. In the center stood a coffin, too small for an adult. Around it, candles had melted into long, skeletal columns. Upon the wall hung a tapestry of a crowned figure with no face. Beneath the coffin, carved into the floor, were words in Latin quod natus est, non relinquitur, that which is born does not depart. The next morning, Ferdinand fell violently ill. He shook for hours, delirious, muttering to no one in particular. Servants found him curled in a fetal position, clutching a child's rosary that had not belonged to him. The royal physicians blamed a fever. The Queen demanded fumigations and prayers. But when Ferdinand woke, something in him had changed. He no longer wept during examinations. He stopped asking why he was different. He asked instead to study embalming. When told no, he asked how blood could be preserved in glass. Within the year, he requested his own chamber away from the main nursery. There, he began creating things. Dolls made of wire and cloth, maps drawn in red ink, charting nothing the tutors recognized. Small cages, each containing the same thing, silence. One evening, a servant overheard him whispering to the tapestry he had taken from the hidden room. The boy's voice was soft, devout, trembling with something between reverence and terror. "I understand now," he said. "I am not broken. I am chosen." No one entered that chamber again without his permission. By the time Ferdinand turned 12, the rumors had begun. Whispers of nocturnal rituals, strange lights beneath the chapel, a child who rarely blinked and spoke Latin in his sleep. But still, the court celebrated his growth as though nothing were wrong. The portraits were commissioned, the hymns were sung. The kingdom waited for the boy to become a man. But deep within El Escorial, in the cold chambers lined with saints and shadows, Ferdinand was becoming something else entirely. Not quite heir, not quite monster. Something holy, something hidden. And Spain, without knowing it, had already begun to pay the price. By the time Ferdinand reached his 18th year, the palace at El Escorial had reshaped itself around his presence. The long corridors, once filled with music and visiting diplomats, had grown quiet. Tapestries no longer depicted victory or conquest, but scenes of saints pierced with arrows and mothers weeping over stillborn children. Servants avoided looking directly at him when they bowed. No one spoke of the wedding, yet preparations marched on. The council had selected Maria Antonia of Naples as Ferdinand's bride. At 18, she was considered ideal, modest, devout, politically beneficial, and unassuming. She arrived with a dowry of alliances and an education in silence. From the moment she stepped foot on Spanish soil, the air around her grew thick with expectation. Ferdinand watched her arrival from a latticed window in the eastern wing. She wore blue velvet and held her chin high. He noted her walk graceful, unhurried, and the way her fingers twitched against the folds of her gown. He turned away without speaking. That night, he summoned his personal engineer. The man was a French craftsman with trembling hands and few words, brought years earlier to work on the secret mechanisms of the palace false doors, surveillance mirrors, hydraulic locks. Ferdinand handed him a drawing. It depicted a device that resembled a cross between a religious relic and a medical tool, fashioned in leather and silver, with a thin tube coiling through its core. "Make it," the prince said. "Polish it as you would a chalice." Maria Antonia's wedding day passed in an uneasy fog. The mass was long, the procession was slow, the choir sang, though no one dared raise their voices too high. That night, The royal couple was escorted to their chambers. Candles burned at every corner. 2 bishops stood outside the doors. The queen gifted her daughter-in-law a crucifix. The king muttered a blessing. Then the doors closed. Maria Antonia had been told little. She expected discomfort, perhaps awkwardness. She did not expect the gleaming device Ferdinand unveiled, nor the chill in his fingers as he guided her body to match his instructions. He spoke few words, only murmuring, "This is the proper way. I've prepared." Her pain was immediate, sharp, and sustained. When she cried out, he recited a psalm under his breath. The next morning, she did not rise. A physician was summoned in secret. His notes, never officially recorded, described lacerations and bruises inconsistent with any normal conjugal act. Maria Antonia was given laudanum and instructed to remain in bed. Her maid, a girl from Naples who had served her since childhood, wept in the hallway until the steward silenced her with a hand over her mouth and a purse of coins. Ferdinand returned to his study. He opened his leather-bound journal and wrote a full page describing the angles, responses, duration. He noted Maria's breath rate, her skin temperature, the patterns of her resistance. The writing was clinical, detached. Near the margin, he added a sketch of a new attachment for the device. The weeks that followed passed in ritual repetition. Every third night, he visited her chambers. Each time, he brought a different variation of the instrument, each more refined. Maria began to tremble when she heard his footsteps. Her letters home were censored, rewritten to reflect harmony and bliss. The queen visited once and found her daughter-in-law pale and thin-lipped, fingers digging into the embroidery of her gown. "She is just adjusting," the queen said to no one in particular. New wives are always delicate, but Maria Antonia was not adjusting. She was unraveling. By spring, she refused food. Her hair began to fall. Her prayers grew frantic, whispered in a Neapolitan dialect the palace priests did not understand. She kept a candle burning day and night, terrified of the dark. Her maid was dismissed after being found in possession of a drawing Ferdinand had discarded, an anatomical rendering of Maria's body marked with red ink and cryptic measurements. Rumors spread beyond the palace. Some said she was cursed. Others whispered of madness. A bishop reported seeing her in the chapel late at night, barefoot, sobbing before the statue of the Virgin. Ferdinand dismissed these claims. He had grown more confident, more solemn. He began calling himself the vessel, declaring that he had found a method to overcome the flaw within him. He asked his engineer to begin work on a mechanical cradle. Maria Antonia died 2 years after the wedding. The cause was listed as complications of the lungs. No autopsy was permitted. She was buried quickly, without procession. Her family in Naples was informed via formal letter, expressing profound regret and promising a commemorative mass in her name. Ferdinand did not weep. On the night of her death, he entered his private chamber, lit a row of candles, and removed the device from its case. He polished it in silence and placed it on a velvet cushion beside the altar he had built in the corner of the room. Above it hung a framed page from his journal, a line drawing of a woman bowed in prayer, inscribed with the words, "From sacrifice, rebirth." Later that week, a servant discovered a locked drawer in Maria Antonia's chamber. Inside were scraps of fabric, stained with blood and ink. One piece bore a phrase written in trembling Latin Domine, "Libera me de manu eius." Lord, deliver me from his hand. The king ordered the drawer burned. The queen demanded silence. The court moved on. A new alliance would be arranged. A new bride would be chosen. But deep in the eastern wing of the palace, Ferdinand continued his notes. The device was ready. The second crown, as he now called it, had fulfilled its purpose. The body had failed. Yes, but the ritual was intact. The path was set. What had begun in pain would end in legacy. And still, no one dared question the heir to the Spanish throne. When the bells of the royal monastery tolled in 1816 to mark the second marriage of Ferdinand, they did not ring with celebration, but with the weight of duty. Spain had been battered by war, bled by Napoleon's occupation, and left gasping under the fragile return of Bourbon rule. Ferdinand, now in his 30s, stood before the altar beside a new bride, Isabel of Portugal. She was young, healthy, and chosen not for affection but for her supposed fertility. She wore a dress of cream silk and looked ahead without flinching. She did not yet know what waited for her behind the velvet walls of the Spanish court. Ferdinand had changed since Maria Antonia. His posture was more rigid, his speech more measured, his eyes colder and more calculating. The journals he once hid were now stored in a locked cabinet in his study, catalogued by date and subject. He had begun to see himself not as a man denied nature, but as a sovereign elevated beyond it. Where others saw defect, he saw divine redirection. He believed the body was a flawed shell, and that through pain, obedience, and ritual, it could be made useful. Isabel would be the vessel. Their wedding night was quiet. The guards stationed outside heard nothing. When Isabel emerged 2 days later, her skin was pale and her hands trembled beneath her gloves. She did not speak of what had occurred. Her chambermaid, a woman from Lisbon, attempted to resign the same week, but was found dead in the palace garden, face down in the fountain. The Queen Mother declared it an accident. Isabel said nothing. Ferdinand resumed his studies. A wing of the palace was quietly converted into what he called the inner chapel. But no clergy entered. Its walls were lined with cabinets of surgical instruments, imported glass, and hand-bound tomes on anatomy and embryology. He read obsessively, copying diagrams and inventing theories of spiritual inheritance. One such belief that divine essence could be transferred into matter through sacred violation became central to his nightly rituals. Isabel endured. She was not weak, but measured in her resistance. She prayed, fasted, and surrounded herself with loyal attendants who acted as barriers between her and her husband's desires. Yet even these protections could not shield her completely. Ferdinand insisted upon regular meditations, during which she was required to submit to his tests, devices crafted in iron, brass, or polished wood, each assigned a number and name. He recorded her reactions meticulously, comparing her pulse before and after. He believed that when her breath faltered, it was evidence of divine resonance. In time, the palace learned to move around these rituals. Dinners were postponed without explanation. Courtiers turned their eyes to the floor when Isabel entered a room, noting the bruises along her collarbones, the sudden absence of her voice for weeks at a time. The priests sent to offer confession were never allowed beyond the threshold of her rooms. By 1817, Ferdinand had constructed what he referred to as the sanctorium. Hidden behind a false wall in the Eastern Library, it contained shelves of blood samples, tissues, and fragments of cloth. In one corner stood a mechanical cradle connected to a series of valves and tubes, designed to mimic the rhythms of the womb. He believed that if the body could not produce life naturally, it could be coaxed into doing so through mechanical divination. Isabel became pregnant 3 times. Each time, the announcement was made prematurely. Each time, The child failed to survive beyond the first month in the womb. Her body, already weakened, began to give way. Her hair thinned, her sleep fractured into trembling hours. One night, she was discovered by a servant kneeling before a fireplace, whispering to a soot-covered crucifix, her hands bloodied from digging her nails into her own thighs. She did not recognize the servant. She only repeated the same line, "He will split me until I am whole." Ferdinand responded to these miscarriages not with grief, but with frustration. He revised his journals, adjusted his methods, and brought in new instruments from Austria and Prussia. His court physician, a man loyal more to gold than to God, began sedating Isabel before certain procedures, claiming it reduced divine interference. The Queen's attendants were rotated weekly to prevent them from forming bonds or witnessing too much. The palace walls grew thicker with secrets. Some claimed that screams could be heard from beneath the monastery during Mass. Others spoke of jars containing small, unformed bodies hidden in drawers beneath the sanctorium. A foreign envoy reported seeing a series of paintings in Ferdinand's private gallery, all of women with halos, their faces blank, each bearing a different wound across their abdomen. Despite it all, Isabel remained, not because she accepted her fate, but because she understood the nature of monarchy. If she left, she would be silenced. If she resisted, she would be broken entirely. So she survived not as a wife, but as a relic, passed through corridors like a holy artifact, revered and untouched. One winter evening, Ferdinand returned from the chapel later than usual. Isabel lay in bed, feigning sleep. When he approached, she did not flinch. He placed a small wooden box beside her pillow and left without a word. Inside was a bundle of soft cloth, and within it, a porcelain figure of a swaddled infant, faceless, mouthless, inscribed along the spine with a phrase in Latin, "Spiritus sine corpore regnat," the spirit rules without a body. Isabel placed the figure in her fireplace and watched it crack under the heat. She did not speak of it again. Ferdinand never asked. Their silence became the new language of the court. By 1819, Ferdinand's belief in spiritual engineering had reached its zenith. He held midnight ceremonies in the inner chapel, lit candles made from tallow and ash, and recited litanies of failed births as sacred chants. He declared Isabel purified by divine resistance and began drafting a treatise on royal blood as an alchemical element. In his mind, he was not tormenting his queen. He was forging her into a vessel capable of birthing a new order. The court remained obedient. Ministers who questioned his behavior were dismissed or disappeared. Servants who spoke too freely were reassigned to colonial postings in the Americas. The air inside El Escorial grew dense, stagnant, laced with the perfume of rot masked by incense. Ferdinand walked its halls with confidence, carrying a cane carved with runes only he could translate. He smiled often, but never with his eyes. Behind him, the sanctorium expanded. In front of him, Isabel shrank. And around them, the empire trembled, caught between its duty to a dying monarchy and its horror at what it had allowed to fester within its sacred walls. Ferdinand no longer saw a queen. He saw a shrine. And in his mind, shrines could bleed. Shrines could open. Shrines could give birth to salvation. And Isabel, pale as the marble saints lining the chapel, had learned at last that to survive was not to live, but to remain still, unseen, and untouched by what her husband believed he was becoming. That winter, Isabel stopped speaking altogether. Her words, once whispered through prayers and pleas, dissolved into silence. She no longer flinched at the sound of his cane in the hallway. She no longer cried when the clock struck the hour of his arrival. Her stillness became so complete that even the servants began to lower their voices in her presence, as though afraid their breath might shatter her entirely. Ferdinand, unmoved, called it tranquility of spirit. He recorded her silence as a form of compliance. To him, it was proof that she had transcended the body, that her resistance had been purged. He declared the chamber sanctified and stopped the nightly procedures. But he did not abandon the sanctorium. Instead, he expanded it. New instruments arrived under the guise of state deliveries. A second altar was constructed, this time made of black marble. On it stood a single empty cradle carved from ash wood and bone. Beneath it, a plaque read, "To the one who will carry my legacy." In the council, ministers began urging the king to consider securing the line of succession. Whispers rose in the court about a third marriage, one that might finally deliver a child. Ferdinand listened, nodded, and said nothing. But that night, in the silence of his private chapel, he lit a single candle, knelt before the cradle, and pressed his fingers to the cold stone. "The body is dead," he murmured, "but the throne must still bear fruit." Far beneath the palace, behind sealed doors and stained glass, preparations had already begun. The halls of El Escorial no longer echoed with the sounds of music or prayer. The tapestries hung lower. The candles burned closer to the floor. Isabel remained confined to her chambers, a silent presence draped in ivory, attended by women who never spoke above a whisper. To the outside world, the queen had become a symbol of grace. Inside the palace, she was a vessel that had long since emptied. Ferdinand did not mourn her decline. He regarded it as the conclusion of a necessary process. Isabel's silence had, to him, fulfilled a sacred role. She had absorbed his trials, his failures, and now existed as a completed object used, spent, and reverent by her very stillness. The sanctorium continued to expand beneath the chapel. Instruments were polished and categorized. Fluids were sealed in glass. Cloth was soaked, labeled, archived. The second altar remained untouched, its cradle still waiting. In 1829, Ferdinand married again. Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies was his niece by blood. Yet no one protested the match. Spain was desperate. The empire was fraying, its colonies slipping away one by one. The king, grown pale and thick around the waist, no longer rode horses or attended councils without a chair nearby. His hands trembled when he held a quill. But the issue of succession, of producing a legitimate heir, remained the unyielding weight upon the crown. Maria Cristina was 23. She arrived in Madrid accompanied by priests, diplomats, and a retinue of Sicilian physicians who had been instructed never to ask questions. She wore black upon her arrival, citing mourning for a cousin. When she first met Ferdinand in person, she bowed with grace and did not flinch when he pressed his lips against her gloved hand. Their marriage ceremony was brief. Ferdinand walked slowly down the aisle, his face expressionless. Those in attendance noticed the hollowness of his cheeks, the discoloration beneath his eyes. The archbishop fumbled with the ring. A moment of silence fell over the congregation, thick and unnatural, as though the cathedral itself had held its breath. Within days, Maria Cristina was moved into the southern wing, a part of the palace long abandoned since the death of Charles III. She was assigned a staff of 8, none of whom had served Isabel. Ferdinand visited her twice in the first week. The third time, he arrived with a small wooden box, inside of which rested a cloth bundle and a key. He placed them on her desk and said only, "You will understand when the time is right." Maria Cristina, unlike her predecessors, did not ask questions. She followed the routines laid out for her. She prayed each morning, ate in silence, and wrote letters to her sisters in code, knowing well that the royal correspondence was reviewed. Her patience was not weakness, it was preparation. Weeks passed. The king grew weaker, his legs swelled, his breath shortened. He avoided court functions and began delegating decisions to his confessor. Ministers whispered of regency, but Ferdinand remained focused. He commissioned new instruments from Venice, wrote pages of instructions to be read aloud to Maria Cristina before each visit, and had a second sanctorium chamber prepared. This one, accessible only through a stone passage behind the sacristy. In the spring of 1830, Maria Cristina became pregnant. The announcement spread cautiously. Bells rang for the first time in years, but only once. The court gathered for Mass, and priests thanked the heavens for the gift of continuity. Ferdinand, in private, had the cradle on the black altar replaced with a new one, this time made of ivory, inlaid with a single red jewel in the center of the headrest. A nursemaid was brought in from Segovia, and all servants assigned to Maria Cristina were replaced overnight. The pregnancy progressed without incident, though Maria Cristina grew thin. She avoided meat and insisted on sleeping upright. She was said to dream in Latin. Her letters home became erratic, filled with sudden breaks and repeated invocations of saints, long since removed from the calendar. On a rainy October night, she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. The king did not attend the delivery. He waited in the sanctorium, seated beneath a painted canopy depicting the Virgin holding a crown of thorns. When the nursemaid brought him the infant swaddled in blue, he did not smile. He raised the child, held her to his forehead, and whispered, "You are the final seal." A week later, the court painter was summoned. Ferdinand instructed him to paint the child as a boy. No curls, no ribbons, no softness, just a crown above the brow and a sword in the background. The artist obliged. Rumors ignited like dry leaves in wind. Some claimed the child was not Ferdinand's. Others said she had been born with a mark upon her back, a red birthmark shaped like a cross. Whispers of replacement, sorcery, and falsified bloodlines filled the halls of Madrid. Ferdinand, deaf to all of it, ordered new laws drafted. In the spring of 1831, the Pragmatic Sanction was revived, an ancient decree allowing a daughter to inherit the throne. The Carlist faction rose in protest. The court became a battlefield of masks. Nobles pledged loyalty with one hand and wrote letters of dissent with the other. Ferdinand remained within El Escorial, emerging only for baptisms, funerals, and the Feast of the Assumption. He grew gaunter. His skin became gray. His breath carried the scent of iron. But he spoke with fervor. He called Isabella his miraculous proof. He carried her into council meetings, placed her upon the throne beside him, and asked the ministers to address her as Infanta of Blood. His confessor began to show signs of fear. The cradle in the sanctorium was removed. In its place stood a pedestal carved from black stone, upon which Ferdinand placed a sealed vial containing a thin sliver of tissue. He claimed it was the original line of kings, preserved. Maria Cristina retreated from public life. Her health deteriorated, though she was only in her 20s. She rarely saw Isabella outside of official ceremonies. It was said she spent hours in the chapel, unmoving, hands pressed against the walls, as if trying to listen to the heartbeat of the stone. In the final months of 1832, Ferdinand took to his bed. His limbs swelled, his mouth frothed with ulcers. He refused laudanum, insisting his pain was necessary. At night, he muttered to himself, speaking in tongues long lost to the church. He demanded the sanctorium be sealed. He instructed that no one but Isabella could enter the chamber after his death. Outside the palace, rebellion brewed. The Carlist claim grew louder. Spain waited. And within the heart of El Escorial, under vaulted ceilings and beneath painted saints, the last breath of a king prepared to leave behind not a legacy of strength, but a lineage soaked in ritual, silence, and blood. By the spring of 1833, the palace of El Escorial no longer felt like a seat of power. It had become a mausoleum of the living, its air thick with smoke from devotional oils, its walls bloated with tapestries that hung too low, hiding cracks in the stone. The scent of iron, mildew, and burning myrrh had settled permanently into the corridors. Ministers came and went with heads bowed, their hands cold, their mouths sealed. No decree passed without a priest's approval. No prayer ended without the king's name whispered after Amen. Ferdinand remained mostly in bed, his body swollen from gout, infection, and a growing mass in his lower abdomen that no physician dared name. His skin broke easily. His gums bled when he spoke, yet he refused rest. Every evening, he demanded to be lifted into a carved wooden chair and carried to the sanctorium. There, among the cold instruments and sealed vials, he sat for hours, writing in a thick, leather-bound book he called The Continuance. No one was allowed to read it. He had not touched Maria Cristina in months. She moved through the palace like a relic, her steps measured, her face hidden behind a veil even within the private quarters. Her second daughter, Luisa Fernanda, had been born weeks earlier. Rumors swirled in court that the child had been taken directly to a monastery and baptized without the king's presence. Maria Cristina neither confirmed nor denied it. She no longer responded to questions with words. Instead, she lit candles, dozens each day. Some said she no longer slept. The kingdom beyond the palace was unraveling. The Carlist claim had gathered strength, challenging the legality of Ferdinand's daughters as heirs. Streets in Madrid were flooded with pamphlets, printed in secret, naming Isabella a puppet, her blood impure, her legitimacy a fabrication born of deceit. Riots flickered and were drowned in blood. The crown cracked under the weight of factions it could no longer control. Inside the sanctorium, Ferdinand prepared. He had ordered his confessor to summon artists, not doctors. The painters who arrived were instructed to render not portraits, but anatomical illustrations. Each drawing was labeled meticulously. The cross-sections were exacting, the colors lifeless. One image displayed a fetus curled within a crowned womb, circled by rings of Latin text. Another depicted a glass jar filled with a suspended organ, red and shriveled. The caption beneath it read simply, "Root of Line." These were not kept in the palace archives. They were placed inside a sealed vault beneath the sanctorium floor, along with a lead box containing bones wrapped in silken shrouds. No official birth or death had been recorded for those remains. When the vault was closed, Ferdinand placed both hands on the stone lid and muttered, "Legacy requires silence." His body continued to decay. By midsummer, he could no longer speak clearly. His tongue had darkened, his breath grew fetid. Maria Cristina entered his chambers once, sat beside him, and pressed a crucifix to his hand. He turned away, his fingers curled not around the cross, but around the spine of the continuance, which now had grown thick with entries, sketches, and sealed pages. She left without another word. At night, he called out for Isabella, though she was kept from him. He repeated her name between coughs, followed by phrases that made no sense to the physicians tending him. "The vessel must pass," he rasped. "Seal the wound. Crown the mouth." They did not understand. He refused morphine. He demanded pain. When they offered him a priest for last rites, he replied only, "Not yet. She hasn't arrived." The following day, he asked to be taken to the sanctorium one final time. The corridors had been cleared. The servants carried him like a relic, his limbs wrapped in linens, his chest barely rising. He insisted on being left alone with the cradle. That night, smoke seeped through the cracks of the chapel. When the guards entered at dawn, they found him on the stone floor, beneath the altar, surrounded by broken glass and extinguished candles. His hand was outstretched, fingers curled around nothing. Ferdinand VII died without a final blessing. The announcement to the public was swift and sterile. His Majesty has passed into the Lord's care after fulfilling his divine duty. No mention was made of the sealed rooms, the rituals, the records. Maria Christina did not attend the burial. Instead, she remained in the chapel, surrounded by candles, reciting verses to herself, her eyes unfocused. But the silence could not last. Within a week, palace guards uncovered a hidden corridor behind the eastern cloister. It led to a chamber not listed on any blueprint. Inside were the remnants of Ferdinand's work vials of dark liquid, hand-carved models of the female pelvis, sheets of parchment bound with human hair, jars filled with fluid and fragments of tissue suspended in amber. In one corner stood a marble pedestal. Atop it, a small crystal case held a piece of organic matter, grayish, shrunken, veined with blue. An inscription was etched into the glass. Air denied. The sanctorium was sealed, the contents removed. Vatican officials arrived without announcement, escorted by royal guards, and left under cover of night with 6 sealed crates. Their contents were never inventoried. Rumors spread that Ferdinand's preserved organ had been kept in a reliquary, passed secretly between bishops before being locked in the archives of St. Peter's. Some whispered that the continuance had survived and was hidden in a monastery in Avila, guarded by monks who had vowed never to speak of what they had read. None of it could be proven. What remained was his daughter. Isabella II was crowned at the age of 3. She was placed on a throne carved taller than her own height, draped in robes stitched for a body not yet grown. She did not speak during the ceremony. She blinked often, as though blinded by the chandeliers above her. Outside the palace, mobs gathered. The Carlist War had begun. Men fought not for the soul of Spain, but for the legitimacy of blood. Within the cathedral, a lone priest lit a candle for Ferdinand's soul. He whispered a prayer, crossed himself, and paused before leaving. The flame flickered violently, though no wind passed.